Thank you for inviting me. I wanted to first show you guys, it was the study I want to talk about today it was quite a monstrosity because it started off with us thinking about military spending and the fact that we're in a moment in history that is uncomparable to previous moments in history. And so it was coming basically from different social movements that we work with in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, who wanted to create a concrete analysis of the concrete conditions we're in. And we recently started building a big data platform. So we've now integrated different world indicators from the World Bank, from the IMF, from SIPRI, from many different databases, so we can start to build more statistical data to support a lot of the Tricontinental studies. At Tricontinental, we largely serve social organization, trade unions, grassroots organizations across the world. That's the reason we were founded and created. And so the study was a collective effort where we had different social practitioners, movement leaders contributing to the conceptions and conceptualization within the text. And we ended up having it sort of almost 200 pages long, but you can see it on our website at thetricontinental.org. And the executive summary, if you will, is the first dossier of this year. So you can check it out there. And I highly encourage it because we're trying to get as much debate and discussion about some of the contents of this study, Hyper-Imperialism, a Dangerous and Decadent Stage. So I'm going to share a few slides, and if you can, Andres, just give me like a 5-minute warning when I'm close to time, that would be great. Largely, you're going to see most of the content is from the study. Most of the charts are within the study, so you can peruse them at your own leisure at a later stage. So the study initially is part of a series of studies we have called Studies on Contemporary Dilemmas, because we're part of an international process called the International People's Assembly that's trying to confront what we call the dilemmas of humanity. And various social practitioners, movement leaders, activists all felt that we're in a very different qualitative moment right now. And part of what brought us to thinking about this study is we wanted to figure out and concretely try to establish and assess what does the world look like? What is the conjuncture we're in right now? And what are its characteristics? And I'll talk a little bit about the dangerous aspect to what we're calling hyper-imperialism. So we're building off of the, Lenin spoke about inter-imperialist wars in the pre-World War I period. We had different phases after World War II. We saw the ascendancy of American imperialism. It basically takes the forward of the stage up until continues to be, but we've seen that it's acting in a very different way. And initially, when we named it, one of the words that was being used was super imperialism, but that had an association that A, comes from Kautsky, which we weren't necessarily making the same argument, but B, we were trying to think about the fact that the word super seems beyond, like something that can't be challenged, that it's beyond our reach in terms of our social organizations organizing against capital, against international capital. And so the word hyper was put on the table, which we believe is a more apt way to put it, because hyper has that quality to it, this exaggeration that we're seeing right now in terms of the US-led military integrated bloc and how it asserts its power and hegemony across the world. It's no longer by consent, it's by violence, as we've seen in Palestine, as we've seen in many parts of the world for the last few decades. So the study initially started off with one of my colleagues, Gisela Cernadas and John Bellamy Foster of Monthly Review. They were trying to more accurately quantify US military spending. And I'm sure most of you are aware of SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, or International Institute for Peace Research. And they are generally considered the authority or the definitive place to go in terms of military spending, not only by the US, but across the world. But Gisela and John Bellamy Foster started looking at the balance of accounts and the public accounts of the US and found that actually the calculations made by SIPRI and what is presented by the US military Defense Department is vastly underestimated, or gives you a much lower figure. And what they found by using, public records of the US government, they managed to calculate that not the 800 billion that is presented by the US government, as well as SIPRI, who does do some small adjustments, but it's relatively small in the scheme of things, just a couple of millions that they add to it. What they found was that the actual true US military expenditure is 1.537 trillion US dollars. 1.5 trillion, that's almost double the reported and generally accepted. And then we also wanted to think about, well, not only does the US have 1.5 in its own military, but it of course commands the resources of the NATO countries, as well as non-NATO countries that are aligned to it, such as Japan, the Philippines, and also parts in Taiwan. And what we found is that in terms of global military spending, the US basically has access to and spends almost 75% of global spending. And why is this important for us? One of the things is, in the last few years, since the Trump administration, we've heard about, and I'm sure you all hear it in the news, and I'm really interested to hear from you guys what the climate and the level of political debate is in your university, in your country, is that China and Russia are presented as the kind of global threat to peace by the West. But if you look at the data, it's simply not true. I mean, China spends 10% of global military spending. This is 2002 figures. We have an updated number that will be coming out in a month or so. And that Russia is even less, at 3%. And so we thought this was important because the general hegemonic discourse is that China and Russia are a threat to the world. They are, pursuing all means to disrupt the international world order, and they're being painted as the catalyst for potential problems in the future. But in reality, if we look at the budget, if we look at, and I'm going to show you a few other statistics, the US-led military bloc, the US on its own, accounts for the lion's share of the spending in the world. And if you look at that in terms of spending, let me go to the next one, actually. If we look at it in terms of, I think I have the same slide. Wait, here we go. If you look at it in per capita terms, the top spenders in the world, the US vastly outranks China, Russia, and even, we listed India because of its large economy and large population. In per capita terms, the US is spending 12.6 times higher than the global average. And of course, it's no surprise that Israel at the time was spending 7.2. It's surely much larger. But as you can see, it's countries in the global north that have the highest per capita spending. And we thought this was important for also some secondary reasons, is that we believe that this is an important moment when we've been seeing the rise of things like BRICS, the rise of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the rise of the group of friends in defense of the United Nations Charter. We're seeing that they are kind of nascent organizations of the global south that are trying to emerge and trying to establish themselves on a totally different terrain, whilst the US, or the West and global north, as we're calling it, the global north versus the global south is how we're conceptualizing it. The global north is an integrated political, economic, and military bloc. And we think that this is important to say because we can't have illusions, especially as activists and progressive organizations who want to change the inequality in the world, want to challenge the unending and ceaseless violence that comes from the US-led military bloc. It's also important to have a sober assessment of exactly what resources and architecture and apparatus they have. And from an African perspective, when we were looking at the military landscape, we looked at, here you can see the military bases of the US, that it has the largest military footprint across the world. As you can see here in Africa, we're kind of a buffer zone. And as an African and an African activist, it's important to talk about this in Africa because we have so many internal dynamics that we're struggling with that we often can't see the bigger picture and how Africa is acting as a buffer zone for AFRICOM, the United States Africa Command, and various military operations. If you look in 2022 alone, global North countries that quote unquote deployed, we would say intervened, it's largely concentrated in Africa and of course parts of what is called the Middle East. And the biggest number of military deployments in 2022 that were in Mali, in fact, the country over here. And it was 31 deployments as compared to Iraq was 30, Lebanon was 18, the Central African Republic was 13, and South Sudan was 13. And those are the 5 countries that had the most military deployments. And we thought this is important to share with our organizations and to the different social movements, because the peace movement isn't really as strong in Africa and doesn't have a traditional base like it does in Europe, in Latin America, in the US itself. So we thought it's important to understand how Africa is its own form of a frontier for the kind of geopolitical interests of the US. And this was happening when we started thinking about doing the study. I don't know if you recall, last year in January, the head of, as you can see, Jens Stoltenberg of NATO and the heads of the European Union and the European Council signed an agreement where they said this: we will further mobilize the combined set of instruments at our disposal, be they political, economic, or military, to pursue our common objectives to the benefit of our 1 billion citizens. And we think I find this like astounding that you can actually say this, because it's a clear it's a segregation of us versus the world, the West versus the rest. And it hasn't been said as clearly in the last couple of decades in comparison to perhaps during the height of the Cold War period. And so we found it important to try to think about what exactly is the US's geostrategic view of the world, what are its main priorities. And based on discussions with different political leaders, we found that the control of Eurasia is number 1. As you can see, if I jump back, sorry if I'm going too fast, tell me if I need to slow down. There's a clear encirclement, particularly here with South Korea and Japan and in the South China Sea, as well as around Europe and Asia. There's an encirclement of Eurasia and an attempt to thwart, of course, China's development, Russia's development, and other challenges to US hegemony in the world. And of course, one of the important things is that the frontline targets of the Global North Bloc, the imperialist bloc, as others would call it, are those with nuclear capacity or near nuclear capacity. So the big, I guess, more subjective thing that we did is that if you look at the global North, it's clear how integrated it is politically, economically, militarily. But on the other hand, we have the global South, which isn't a bloc, isn't integrated, doesn't have extensive, economic, political, military agreements amongst one another, let alone any kind of institutional capacity that is worth or possibly able to challenge the US military bloc or US-led military bloc. And so we started to think about how can we better group or understand the different geopolitical relations that have existed and that are being fostered in this moment. So we started off with the study focuses much more, I think, on the global North Bloc, and we try to conceptualize it in concrete terms, but we started to visualize it in terms of these concentric rings, with the closest allies being the US, UK, Canada, Australia, Israel, and New Zealand. And these are the historical, settler states, white settler states that are formed out of white settler projects. And we identified them also on the basis of how integrated their intelligence agreements on their intelligence work is. Because since the 40s, 50s, 60s, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, Israel, and New Zealand have had very close ties in terms of their information sharing and their intelligence. And so the next group, where Germany is a part of it, and the Nordic countries, interestingly, are those who are part of the the 9 eyes is, or the 14 eyes, should I say, where this was work done by Julian Assange, who was recently finally let free. Now he's, of course, suffered in a terrible situation for the last few decades for the work he did, which included releasing concrete evidence of the different forms of intelligence integration that is happening between those core countries and then the countries that followed. And so basically, the further away you are from the center, the less strategic you are to the US's foreign policy, and the closer you are, the more strategic you are or integrated you are. And of course, for the US, Canada, and many of the countries in the second ring and third ring, they also share a common history. So we also wanted to reflect on the fact that most of these countries in Ring 1 and Ring 2 have been active in the African slave trade, have been colonizers, have performed domestic genocides, are Anglo-American white settler states, were part of the participants at the Berlin conference that divided Africa. They awarded parts of China to Japan in 1919 after World War I ended through the Treaty of Versailles, have also been, fascist powers in World War II, and of course the US being the one who's wielded nuclear warfare against civilians. And again, this is important for us. This is Leila Khaled, who's a Palestinian political leader and activist, and who actually participated in a conference that we hosted in South Africa last year. And this is what she said during the conference, that referring to the global north, to Jens Stoltenberg, etc., who was saying they are the heroes of terrorism, the imperialist forces everywhere in the world, in Iraq, in Syria, and who are preparing to attack China. All of what they say about terrorism turns out to be about them. People have the right to resist with all means to it, including armed struggle. This is in the UN Charter. So they are the ones who are violating the rights of people for resistance because it's their right to restore their freedom. But basically, I share this quote because I think it's the contrast to what the NATO leaders and European Union leaders were saying. The other one interesting aspect is we wanted to kind of challenge the idea that Europe has an independent foreign policy and that Europe is independent of the United States. And one of the ways, which I'd be interested to hear what y'all think, and I can take it to the team if you have any disagreements, is we essentially argue that a lot of the European states have subordinated their sovereignty to the interests of the United States. And one of the markers we were showing was the fact that the German stock exchange has a huge foreign ownership, very little domestic ownership, and this not assignable area can very well likely be foreign ownership. So I'd be interested if anyone knows more about this, because based on the way we've seen the German State Act and the deindustrialization that has happened in the last few decades, and the subordination of their foreign policy interests to US's NATO interests, leads us to believe that, again, the global north is an integrated bloc. It is headed by the US, and that most European countries are subordinated to the interests of the US. The harder part that we had was trying to think about how do we understand the global south. And we started to group them in 6 groupings, because the global south has often been a kind of vague concept that came in vogue in the last few, maybe the last decade or so. And, the global south, most of them are former colonies, have suffered centuries of oppression and humiliation, have been looted and their wealth largely taken to, serve the European markets. But even though we've had processes of like the Third World Project, the Bandung Conference in the 1950s, the Organization of Solidarity with People of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, OSPAL, and even the New Economic Order that was a proposal in 1974, we still don't have a global south that is integrated, that acts collectively, that asserts itself collectively. However, and this is the groupings we put together that are largely subjective, we still need to do more research into it, but it's based on the political trends we identified, is we put them put us in 6 different groupings. One was kind of what we're calling the socialist independents, who are countries who have basically communist parties leading their governments. And they vary. I mean, China is quite a different story from Laos, from Cuba, from Venezuela, but they still lead with us an aim for socialist construction. Whether or not you agree with it is a different conversation. Then the second group, which is an interesting one, is those who are strongly seeking sovereignty. And in here we have Russia, Iran, Belarus, Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, Niger, Syria, Afghanistan, and Eritrea. So part of our thinking not only is that these are countries that are trying to, assert their sovereignty in different ways, whether it's the Sahelian countries that have gone through processes of popularly supported coup d'etats, and who are, I'm sure you've seen the situation in Burkina Faso, who are seeking alternative relationships from France, who are trying to get out of the grip and the colonial legacy of France. And then you have countries like Russia and Iran, who are, direct targets of US sanctions. And essentially, after the socialist countries, this is the group of people who are like next in line for regime change because of their broad anti-US, anti-imperialist ideological orientations, as well as some of their practices in terms of how they're trying to shift their economies away from a lot of the traditional US institutions. The next group we called the current or historic progressives, which has to do, again, they're probably in level 3 of regime change, but who often challenge US hegemony, who often have broad anti-imperialist positions. South Africa, for example, took Israel to the International Court of Justice to hold them accountable for what they're doing in Palestine. We have, Brazil, who's now led by the Lula government, which is more left and more progressive. We have, Zimbabwe, who's been a little bit of a thorn in the side of the US in Africa. And then the last 3 groupings, the fourth one is a bit more straightforward, what we call the new non-aligned, not politically non-aligned, but economically, where they're large enough economies and they're making various attempts, whether or not they're working as a different story, but various attempts to disentangle themselves from the dependency that they've had in Western economies and Western-driven international processes. For example, Indonesia, last year, they created a law that basically banned the export of raw nickel ore, because they have I think 25% of world nickel ore. And now, in part of the law is that if you do want to have access to the nickel, you have to do it in their country, and you have to add some value to it, basically by enhancing the manufacturing capacity. So you can't export raw ore anymore, but it has to be some form of processing of the ore. Then, of course, the biggest grouping is, because this group is made out of 145 countries, is what we call the diverse global south, who are either very small or perhaps, like Argentina, had progressive governments but have fallen back and don't necessarily identify with the global south or with an alternative project. And they're a diverse group that really do vary. And it's, I would say, relatively porous because, for example, we did have Angola initially in the progressive group, but they withdrew from the group of friends in defense of the United Nations Charter. So during the process of the study, they were moved back there. And then lastly, we have the heavy US militarized, which is Korea, the Republic of Korea, and the Philippines. I'm gonna try to go a little quicker now because I think I have probably like 8 or so minutes. But the other aspect is we tried to do a little bit of economic analysis, and a large contribution of that was from one of our colleagues, John Ross, who is a British economist. And what we found is that, as you can see here, even though the US and the UK and other Western countries, particularly those in the G7, have held a large proportion of the world economy, they're not really performing well economically. In the last 10 years or so, the average annual growth rate, the highest ones, that are above, 1% or in the 2 percentile and up are coming from Asian countries, a couple of African countries, 1 or 2 Latin American countries, but largely in Asia. And again, this goes back to the question of why the US is interested in the encirclement of Eurasia, is because Eurasia is outperforming, or the Asian part of Eurasia is outperforming economically the West. But it still paints a sad story for a lot of countries in the global South, like Nigeria, like South Africa, who are, in the negative percentile. An important aspect is that whilst the US still retains, military strength and is quite advanced in certain areas of technology, if we look at different economic indicators, the US is now slowly but surely performing badly economically. They've lost political, They've lost political legitimacy through Gaza, through Ukraine, through various processes. And right now, if you look at the historical trend, slowly but surely, the US is having smaller and smaller average growth rates in terms of their GDP, and are far below what a leading economy of the world should be looking like. We also then tried to compare this in terms of the global South and global North, and by 2006, the global South, which is made up of more countries, did outpace the global North in terms of their share of the world economy. And if we looked at it in terms of the BRICS 10 versus the G7, BRICS in 2016 or so, in terms of their share of the world economy as countries, had already surpassed the G7, which had historically, as you see, had the lion's share of the world economy, around 45% in the early 90s. And then if we look at the share of world industry value added, we see also a similar story as early as 2004, where the BRICS 10 countries are outpacing those of the G7. And then I have 2 more slides. So although these organizations are relatively nascent and, newborn, there seems to be a new mood in the global South. Vijay Prashad, who's the director of Tricontinental, talks about this a lot, and it's part about the research that I'm involved with Vijay, where there are these nascent organizations who are trying to form new forms of multilateralism that don't come from the West and that are amongst the global South, but they're still relatively weak and undefined. I mean, if you take BRICS, for example, the new development bank of the BRICS has yet to actually fund any significant project. And that also, of course, has to do with the differences in politics of the organizations within the BRICS 10. But interestingly, we saw here at the center of these organizations, so it's the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter in green, which is, about the political rights of different countries. Most of them are sanctioned countries, are facing different forms of economic warfare led by the US. Then we have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was created about 10 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, which is more to do about security agreements. And then we have the BRICS 10, which is about more, I guess, economic relationships. But at the center of these, we see China, Russia, and Iran. And we thought this was interesting because in the early 90s, Brzezinski, who was a national advisor in the US government, basically said, the biggest threat to US hegemony would be if China, Russia, and Iran paired up or found a common project. And now we're seeing that, not necessarily planned by these organizations, but by the historical conditions and contemporary conditions, these countries are being pushed closer and closer together, are basically the nightmare of Brzezinski and other senior leaders in the US government is coming to bear. But then the question in the global South, because we're not integrated, because we don't have common processes, because we're not politically aligned, because we have different economic performances, is what brings us together? How do we start to build common platforms through shared interests? And these are kind of broad, and we're hoping in the next few years to do more concrete studies on them. But what we identified, which is not news to anyone per se, is that multilateralism, new modernization, regional scale economies, de-dollarization, global South-led innovation, reducing, monopoly pricing, reparations, debt solutions, food and digital sovereignty and environmental justice are some of the broad platforms that we need to start putting meat to the bones. So that's just some of the highlights of the study and some of the thinking behind it. And we invite anyone who wants to, you can write to me, you can write to others if there's ideas you have or disagreements. We are really happy to open up a channel of dialogue and to discuss this. But most importantly for us is that, and at least for me in Africa, is one of the things we try to dispel is that there is only one imperialism, and it's led by the US. China is not an imperialist. Russia is not an imperialist. This is not an inter-imperialist rivalry the way it was 100 years ago when World War I started. The US is the only imperialist force in the world. It asserts its will right now through violence and coercion, whether it be military intervention, whether it be economic warfare, blockades, sanctions, etc. But it's at the stage where, even though it's increasingly more dangerous, there's a decadency that it can't escape, where the leaders of the West, of the global North, don't have a plan for humanity. Olaf Scholz, Macron, Sunak in the UK, and even forget about the senility of Biden and the hot-headedness of Trump, is they don't have a plan for humanity, and how they act in the world, their foreign policy continues to reaffirm the fact that they are the enemies of progress and the enemies of humanity, and that if we want to be serious about shifting the current world order and challenging the US hegemony, then we need to concretely think about what does the global North look like, what does the global South look like, and what can the global South countries build in as quickly as possible in order to challenge what already seems to be a southward shift in terms of the percentages I mentioned in terms of the share of the economy and world industry. So that's pretty much it for me.